What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with another album review, and today, talking about the biggest release to come out at the end of June, and that is the latest offering from Cleveland upcoming death metal masterminds, 200 Stab Wounds with Manual Manic Procedures. This comes out on June 28th on Metal Blade Records, and this is their first album on Metal Blade. They were on Maggot Stomp from the beginning through their Piles of Festering Decomposition EP, and then their debut album, Slave to the Scalpel, which, if I recall, I did review when it came out back in 2021, and I initially only gave it, I think, like an 8.5 out of 10, but it climbed up for me in terms of a score, and honestly, if I redid my year-end list for 2021, it would have made it, because that album was just chock full of riffs and grooves and catchiness. Here, I feel like 200 Stab Wounds went with that times 10 and adding in some new wrinkles into the thread. So we kick things off with Hands of Eternity, and starts off very different from what I'm accustomed to with this band, with some tasty acoustic guitars, but they feel rather dark and eerie and foreboding. And then that lick, when it goes into the electric guitars, it carries on a catchy melody, and it's on top of like a double time rhythm, and then into lumbering grooves a la Gatecreeper, I would say, would be a good comparison point when it comes down to the lumbering grooves that are all across this album, like on, say, Hands of Eternity. I would also say in tracks like Ride the Flatline and Flesh from Within, like those songs have those kind of like Gatecreeper-esque lumbering grooves where it's not quite doomy, but it's just slower than a traditional death metal groove, slower than it goes. And then of course, there's always going to be some hardcore feels. After all, I know that Steve, the frontman, is a big fan of hardcore bands, so obviously you're going to incorporate a little bit of that in here, but with that hardcore element, adds a little bit more to the hooks that this band is able to project. There's even like a nice triplet gallop here on Hands of Eternity, and then of course low-end tremolos and blast beats. You still get plenty of those all across this album, but then you get a tremolo melody that comes up here on this opening track that honestly felt closer to Melodeath, kind of like At the Gates, I would say, a little bit. And then it gets punky when it comes down to like the riffs and the rhythms, and there's a little bit of punk going on this album, like here on Hands of Eternity, and then later on in tracks like For Flesh from Within, Defiled Gestation, and even the closing track, Parasite, have some more punk-laden rhythms and riffs going on. And then, of course, here with Hands of Eternity, it gets thrashy with a chunky bass line and a clean melody. And, of course, again, that's another thing that's going on this album that's different from Slave to the Scalpel. More attention to detail when it comes down to when can we add melody, when can we shift the tempos, and when can we throw in something else. Gross Abuse, which is the shortest track of the album at under 2 minutes, has this big off-time groove that starts, then it goes into the more hardcore terrain, some angular riffs and double time stomps, and print. Then the title track, cool drum intro with that bass line. Of course, the bass lines on this album that pop up are just nasty. Like, that bass tone on this album is pretty gross, and I forget the name of the producer, but he also has done everything else from 200 Stab Wounds except for the 2 songs that were released last year. But here with the title track, then kind of goes into Cannibal Corpse territory. Like, there's some riffs all across this album that make you think of bands like Cannibal Corpse and Deicide and Blood Red Throne, and I would say even bands like Vomitory, like that kind of like Floridian-inspired death metal or European death metal bands inspired by the Florida sound. Some cool tremolos, thrashy again, and there's even some more melodic death metal touches on here. And this is the first ripping lead you get on the album. Like, there's some cool leads going on here throughout. Release the Stench, big dive bombs and a little lead and groove to start off with, and then for a brief moment, you get a riff and groove that almost feels like Obituary a little bit, before it just turns into like classic death metal tremolos and blasts, breakdown that feels very much like Suffocation. And that breakdown even transitions into a bit of a doomy break. And then to the instrumental Led to the Chamber, Liquefied. Like, Led to the Chamber, the first part, mostly synths and horror ambience, which is cool, but I thought it was probably the least interesting part of the album. But then when it gets into the Liquefied part, you get a cool melodic riff that builds up and into probably one of the best leads on the entire album. And it does end with like 8-bit arcade video game sounds, which I thought was kind of funny. But then you get into the second half of the album with Flesh from Within. It gets thrashy at the beginning before it goes punky. And then there's, of course, some really infectious low-end tremolo riffs and another cool lead. There's even an ending with the clean and acoustic guitars that almost feel like a combination of like a Western film and a horror film kind of combined. Like almost as if it's Good, Bad, and the Ugly in the horror genre, almost. And then Defiled Gestation pretty much picks up from where Flesh from Within left off. And then Double Time, Bolt Thrower, Stomp, more groove, more thrash, blast, tremolos, little melodies peppered in. It gets into those punky gallops, and then probably the most creative moment on the entire album, the lead trade-offs going on were really cool, and then guitar harmonies, which again was not something you really heard at all on Slave to the Scalpel. Then you get to Ride the Flatline, which features Jamie Morgan from Code Orange on vocals. This song has a machine gun riff to start off, and then it gets groovy, and it's one of the catchiest songs on the album. Blasts and tremolos with lead harmonies, quick lead even comes up here and there. And then Jamie's vocals just kind of add like an anguish vibe to the song, and then a really cool breakdown once again. And then the closing track, Parasite, we're back in the Cannibal Corpse territory with the riffs on this song, even an atmospheric lead that builds into shred, and it's another catchy moment on the album. And then some dive bombs, again there's some mellow death touches going on, and then the song ends with big dive bombs like as if you're descending into darkness. So overall, like, 200 Stab Wounds have not lost any of their heaviness. Like, it's still heavy and brutal, but they're adding in all these other elements of melody and harmony and some more like thrashy moments, some lumbering stomps, like just adding more colors to their paint palette, essentially. As far as any negatives, I really only have the one negative that I brought up, and that was the cheesy synths and horror ambience at the start of Led to the Chamber, Liquefied. Perhaps they could have just cut that off and just could have made like a 2-minute guitar lead showcase track, and I think it would have been better. So other than that minor gripe, I thought this was probably better than Slave to the Scalpel, for the simple fact that it sounds like 200 Stab Wounds are starting to spread their wings a little bit, and for that, I am going to give this a 4.5 out of 5. This was awesome. Like, it's catchy. Perhaps, yeah, they'll change riffs a little bit too much. I do wish they could maybe hang on certain riffs for maybe a couple extra bars. But this is what 200 Stab Wounds does. They like to change up riffs and go from one catchy riff to another, and that's just what they do. But yeah, if you are a fan of Cannibal Corpse, I would say like Gatecreeper, Sanguisugabog, basically like if you just love death metal, check this out. But of course, those are just my opinions. What did you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And 200 Stab Wounds, you guys are helping to keep Ohio metal going to this day, and I'm proud to be in the same state as you guys. Keep your horns high, and your dreams wet.
Thank you for your patronage.